The man history remembers as Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, initially named Theodore Robert Cowell. His mother, Louise Cowell, a department store clerk and the eldest daughter of Philadelphia businessman Samuel Cowell, claimed Ted was the result of her brief relationship with Jack Worthington, a mysterious World War II veteran she met after finishing high school in 1946. When Louise was 7 months pregnant, the relationship ended. Louise then relocated from Philadelphia to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, a facility that supported pregnant single mothers during a time when society disapproved of out-of-wedlock births. After Ted's birth, she moved with him from Philadelphia to Tacoma, Washington, to be closer to her uncle, Jack Cowell. Encouraged by friends to attend social events for young adults at the local First Methodist Church, Louise met John Culpeper Bundy, also known as Johnny, a native North Carolinian who had recently left the Navy. In May 1951, Louise and Johnny married, leading to the births of Ted's 4 half-siblings, Linda, Glenn, Sandra, and Richard, in 1952, 1954, 1956, and 1961, respectively. Although Johnny, Ted's stepfather, whom he believed to be his biological father for many years, was usually quiet and reserved, he could be violent if provoked. Psychologists have long debated Ted's complex personality without reaching firm conclusions. Dr. Dorothy Otno-Lewis, a defense psychiatrist, suggested Ted had bipolar disorder, noting how he could rapidly switch from one persona to another, as seen in his interactions with his victims. Others have diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, observing his lack of remorse, tendency toward violence, disregard for truth and norms, and compulsion for theft. Most agree Ted was a sociopath or psychopath. Ted also displayed signs of disturbing sexual deviancies, such as biastophilia, a condition where arousal is linked to assault, as well as voyeurism and sadism. Ted Bundy was a good-looking, athletic man with brown, curly hair, which he later cut short, piercing blue eyes, and an athletic build. Using his charm, he lured victims and evaded police, aided by his ability to alter his appearance by adding a mustache, growing a beard, or changing his hairstyle. One early indicator of his violent inclinations may have appeared at age 3, when his aunt, Julia, awoke to find kitchen knives placed around her by her young, smiling nephew. Apart from this, he seemed like a typical child who believed in Santa Claus and disliked vegetables. However, as he revealed in candid interviews before his execution, even as a child, he sensed a disturbing, indefinable urge that later grew into a compulsion to kill. During his early years with his grandparents and mother in Philadelphia, Bundy was led to believe his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister, due to the stigma around single motherhood. Later, he was told his sister was actually his mother, and his stepfather, Johnny Bundy, was his father. This layered deception may have contributed to his sense of alienation. In 1954, following his half-brother Glenn's birth, the Bundy family moved to a larger home to accommodate the growing family. There, Ted met his 2 childhood friends, Terry Storwick and Warren Dodge, who quickly learned of his temper. Storwick recalled Ted attacking him in a rage after being accidentally hit in the face during a game. Although he attempted team sports like basketball and baseball, Ted struggled to make the team and ultimately focused on skiing, using stolen equipment. Ted's attitude toward his stepfather changed after an antagonistic cousin, John, showed him his birth certificate, revealing Johnny wasn't his biological father. Feeling betrayed, Ted began calling his stepfather John instead of Dad, which strained their relationship. Ted found high school difficult due to low self-confidence, leading him to withdraw from social activities. Although reserved in public, he was vocal in class, trying to portray himself as an intellectual. At the University of Puget Sound, he began forming an outwardly normal persona, while his dark inclinations persisted internally. Ted eventually transferred to the University of Washington to study Chinese in its Asian Studies program, where he opened up and began dating Diane Edwards. Although they spent considerable time together, he refrained from physical intimacy, as though it would tarnish the relationship. Later, he failed a Chinese course at Stanford and, following a breakup, returned to Seattle feeling depressed and started committing petty theft. After reuniting with an old acquaintance, Ted volunteered on the campaign of Art Fletcher, a Republican city councilman. He excelled in his role, eventually becoming Fletcher's driver and informal bodyguard, during which he had his first sexual experience. Subsequently, he worked briefly as a department store salesman, which honed his persuasive skills. In 1969, Ted returned to Washington and met Elizabeth Kendall, a single mother, at a bar. Falsely presenting himself as a law student and aspiring author, he quickly won her over. They considered marriage, but his lies and strange habits strained the relationship. He would peer into windows at night, watch violent pornography, and engage in theft without clear motive. His enrollment in a psychology major led to academic success, which inspired him to pursue law. However, after multiple rejections, he began working at Seattle's Harborview Hospital with psychiatric patients. Despite working on a 1972 election campaign for Governor Dan Evans, where he made a name as an intelligent and promising young man, Elizabeth witnessed disturbing behavior. She recalled incidents such as him bringing home a surgical glove and crowbar. Though the first murder linked to Bundy wouldn't occur until 1974, investigators suspect he had committed murders as early as the 1960s. Armed with numerous recommendations, Bundy gained admission to the University of Utah Law College in 1973. Just before the term began, he made headlines for apprehending a purse thief in Seattle, boosting his public image. This, along with political endorsements, led police to overlook him as a suspect. Encouraged by Marlon Vortman to study closer to home at the University of Puget Sound, Bundy enrolled there, though Elizabeth grew frustrated with her inability to influence his choices. Starting at the University of Puget Sound in an unremarkable office building in downtown Tacoma, Ted quickly realized he had enrolled at a subpar school. By December 1973, he was already reapplying in secret to the University of Utah. Outwardly, Bundy seemed to lead a fairly normal life, with a committed girlfriend, involvement in political campaigns, and aspirations of becoming a lawyer. However, beneath the surface, his darker behaviors and psychology were beginning to emerge. Early on January 4, 1974, Bundy committed his first major crime that we have concrete records of. At around 2 a.m., Karen Sparks, a 21-year-old dance student who also went by the alias Terry Caldwell, turned off her TV and went to bed in her basement room at the house she shared with 3 other men at 4325 8th Avenue in Seattle's University District. When she hadn't come out by 7:30 p.m. the next day, her housemates checked on her and discovered, to their horror, that she had been brutally beaten around the head and was barely alive. She was rushed to the hospital, where she remained in a coma for 10 days before eventually surviving, though with lasting brain damage. Bundy was responsible for this attack. There is, however, reason to believe that this may not have been Bundy's first crime. Recent biographies suggest he may have killed as early as 1961 when he was just a teenager. By the time he assaulted Terry Caldwell, he was likely already an experienced murderer. Over the next decade, Bundy would hone his methods, ultimately becoming one of modern history's most notorious serial killers. His crime spree was greatly aided by the absence of widespread CCTV surveillance in the 1970s and the lack of digital evidence or DNA profiling, tools that are now essential for solving such cases. Just a month after Terry Caldwell's narrow escape, Bundy struck again, targeting Linda Ann Healy. On February 1st, 1974, after returning to her nearby apartment, Healy went to bed, only to be abducted from her room in the early morning hours, never to be seen again. Her death is widely considered Bundy's first confirmed murder. His next known victim was Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, who disappeared on March 12, 1974, while on her way to a jazz concert. Bundy later revealed he had incinerated her skull in his girlfriend Elizabeth's fireplace while she was out. Following this, on April 17, 1974, Bundy lured Susan Elaine Rancourt to his car by feigning disability and asking for help carrying heavy books, a tactic he would repeatedly use to capture young women. Shortly after Rancourt's murder, Bundy informed Elizabeth of his unexpected decision to transfer to Utah by September, framing it as a recent decision, even though he had arranged it months before. During the summer, Ted took a job with the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, DES, where his primary responsibility was working on the biannual budget, which served as a perfect cover for his double life. Over the following months, Bundy continued to kill. Patterns began to emerge. He would often abduct young women, typically in their late teens or early 20s, take them to secluded locations, assault them, and then murder them before disposing of their bodies. Later investigations revealed Bundy would sometimes revisit his victims' remains. Around this period, Bundy also began extending the geographical range of his crimes. He abducted 21-year-old Roberta Kathleen Parks in Oregon rather than Washington. Soon after, on June 1, 1974, he kidnapped and killed 22-year-old Brenda Carroll Ball after she left the Flame Tavern, a popular student bar in Burien, Seattle. From personal accounts and observations, it was revealed that the suspected killer identified himself as Ted and drove a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. The published sketches were unsettling for Elizabeth, who recognized Ted's familiar jawline and couldn't ignore that the portrayed suspect drove the same car as her boyfriend. However, inconsistencies led her to downplay her suspicions, though they resurfaced in the months before his departure when she found a hatchet in his car and noticed his unusually short haircut. Still, she wasn't fully convinced. So when Ted left for Utah in September, just days before the decomposing bodies of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were discovered, she embraced and kissed him goodbye. After arriving alone in Salt Lake City, Bundy quickly began his grim activities, missing classes for 6 weeks while familiarizing himself with the area. A new killing spree began on October 2nd, 1974, when 16-year-old cheerleader Nancy Wilcox was picked up by Bundy in Holiday, Utah, and never seen again. Although Bundy later confessed to her murder, many details he provided were later found to be false, and her body was never recovered. Just over 2 weeks later, on October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, the daughter of Midvale's chief of police, Louis Smith, was abducted after leaving the Pepperoni Pizza Palace. When her body was discovered 9 days later, it was determined that she had likely endured a 5 to 6 day ordeal before her death, and her body appeared disturbingly arranged, with her makeup reapplied, nails painted, and body cleaned, as if she were a doll. As news of these disappearances spread across the state, Jim and Shirley Amy of Salem, Utah, reminded their carefree 17-year-old daughter, Laura, about the dangers of hitchhiking. She shrugged off their warnings, a fatal decision. On Halloween night in 1974, after leaving a party around midnight, Laura encountered Bundy when she hitched a ride on Highway 89 into Lehigh. By this point, Bundy felt invincible, with no reason to believe his next target might escape. On the evening of Friday, November 8th, at Fashion Place Mall, 18-year-old Carol Duranch was approached by a man with a mustache who introduced himself as Officer Roseland. He told her that her car might have been broken into, and they walked to her Chevrolet Camaro, only to find it untouched. Bundy then suggested she accompany him to the Murray Police Headquarters in his Volkswagen Beetle, which she agreed to after he briefly showed what she assumed was police identification. He drove her to a residential area, abruptly stopped, and attacked her. In the struggle, Duranch managed to open the passenger door as he tried to handcuff her, but in his haste, he mistakenly locked both cuffs on the same wrist, allowing her to escape. Duranch fled down the street, ultimately rescued by a passerby. Meanwhile, Bundy was already heading north on Interstate 15 toward Bountiful, searching for his next victim. Near Viewmont High School, where a performance of The Redhead was underway, he entered the lobby in plain sight of hundreds. After a failed attempt with 24-year-old drama teacher Ray Lynn Shepard, he spotted 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent leaving mid-performance. With the audience occupied, he knocked her out in the parking lot, briefly re-entered the auditorium looking disheveled to avoid suspicion, then returned to his car with Kent unconscious. 15 years later, Bundy would confess to her murder. Despite his increasingly reckless actions, police still had no leads. That Christmas, Bundy spent time with Elizabeth and her family in Utah, feeling confident he was undetected. Unknown to him, however, Elizabeth had heard of Melissa Smith's murder and was growing suspicious, yet reassured herself that her Ted, so charming with her family, couldn't be capable of such acts. At the start of 1975, with Utah becoming too dangerous, Bundy shifted to Colorado's ski resorts while continuing his Utah law classes to create alibis if needed. On January 12, 1975, a year into his murder spree, 24-year-old Corinne Campbell took an elevator at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, Colorado, to retrieve a magazine. Bundy, using the steam from the outdoor pool as cover, intercepted her as she walked back to her room, which she never reached. Her body was found a month later. After the Campbell murder, Bundy briefly returned to Washington to see Elizabeth, easing her suspicions. However, doubts returned once he was back in Utah, leading her to call the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. She expressed her concerns, but the detective assured her that Bundy had been investigated and ruled out. This was despite more of Bundy's missing victims being found in early 1975, clearly confirming the presence of a serial killer across Washington, Utah, and Colorado. Returning to law school in Utah, Bundy then targeted Vail, Colorado. He disguised as a disabled man with crutches. He sought out another victim. He soon encountered 26-year-old Julie Cunningham, who was walking to a nearby tavern and asked for her help to his car. Thinking him harmless, she agreed, only to quickly realize he was not. He struck her on the head, handcuffed her, and drove to a secluded spot where he strangled her until she passed out, leaving the passenger door open to make her think she could escape when she regained consciousness. When Cunningham tried to escape, Bundy let her run for a short distance, toying with her before catching up and claiming her life. A few weeks later, in early April 1975, he took the life of 24-year-old Denise Oliverson in Grand Junction, Colorado, and disposed of her body in the Colorado River. He then returned to Utah to send Elizabeth flowers for her 30th birthday. Exactly a month after killing Oliverson, Bundy was in Pocatello, Idaho, where he encountered Lynette Culver, a 12-year-old student at Alameda Junior High School. He lured her into his car and drove her to his room at the Holiday Inn. Her body was never recovered, and for many years, she was listed as missing until Bundy confessed to her murder shortly before his execution in 1989. Chillingly, just weeks later, Bundy was back in Seattle with Elizabeth and her young daughter, Tina, close in age to Lynette. As usual, Elizabeth's suspicions about Ted faded in his presence, but reappeared when he was gone, especially as news reports seemed to implicate him. Bundy's next victim was 15-year-old Susan Curtis, who disappeared in late June in Provo, Utah, on her way back to her dorm to brush her teeth before the Bountiful Orchard Youth Conference banquet. She would be his final victim of 1975, before Bundy was officially identified as a suspect. In the early hours of August 15, 1975, Bundy sat parked on the roadside with his headlights off, studying a map of Salt Lake City while high on marijuana and intoxicated. This state was typical for Bundy while he committed his crimes. But that night, his recklessness would catch up with him. Sergeant Bob Hayward of the Utah Highway Patrol, out on patrol for thieves, approached Bundy's car. Startled, Bundy sped off, but Hayward pursued and quickly stopped him. After examining Bundy's driver's license, Hayward searched the vehicle, discovering handcuffs in the trunk and a gym bag filled with items associated with kidnapping and murder. A 7-inch nylon rope, a tan ski mask with a dark stripe, brown gloves with leather grips, black leather ski gloves, trash bags, a flashlight, 4-inch orange wire, strips of white sheet material, an ice pick, a crowbar, and, most disturbingly, a pair of pantyhose cut with eye and nose holes as a makeshift mask. Believing he'd uncovered burglary tools, Hayward arrested Bundy, who was taken to jail, photographed, and had his murder kit placed in police custody. Released early the next morning on August 16th, Bundy's arrest quickly became known. By the following Tuesday, during a meeting with law enforcement from neighboring counties and states, news of his arrest propelled him to the top of the suspect list. As the investigation zeroed in on him, mounting evidence began pointing directly at Bundy. On August 21st, 1975, he was arrested again at his apartment door. Over the following weeks, investigators connected Bundy to several murder cases in Washington State, Utah, and Colorado. Notably, Bundy's move to Utah for law school, around the same time the murders shifted from Washington to Utah and Colorado, was highly suspicious. But the most compelling evidence surfaced on September 8th, when his Chevron oil card gas receipts matched locations where the crimes had taken place. Law enforcement was now confident they had their killer. On October 2nd, Carol DeRonch, along with drama teacher Raylyn Shepard from Viewpoint High and a friend of Debbie Kent, identified Bundy in a lineup, leading to his arrest for the kidnapping and attempted murder of DeRonch. This triggered a media frenzy, with Bundy's face splashed across national newspapers. Remarkably, during this period in late 1975, Bundy posted $15,000 bail, temporarily securing his freedom while detectives monitored him. Friends and colleagues initially defended him, but eventually, each of his supporters came to the chilling realization that the police might be right. While awaiting his February 1976 trial, Bundy loudly proclaimed his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. However, when the trial began, Judge Stuart M. Hansen Jr. of Salt Lake County swiftly declared Bundy guilty of the attempted kidnapping and murder of Carol DaRonch, sentencing him to 1 to 15 years in prison. Though this conviction removed Bundy from society, a much larger case was building quietly in Colorado, centered on Corinne Campbell, whom Bundy had murdered at the Wildwood Inn in January 1975. With witness testimony placing him at the inn and gas receipts from a nearby station on the day Campbell vanished, Bundy was charged with her murder on January 28, 1977, while in Salt Lake County Prison. In April, Bundy announced he would defend himself in the main trial, giving him access to a law library. On June 7, 1977, he seized this opportunity, escaping through an open window on the second floor of the Aspen courthouse. This first attempt, however, ended within just 5 days. While attempting to flee Aspen in a stolen car, Ted was stopped, apprehended, and returned to Garfield County Jail. Afterward, he was required to wear leg irons and chains in court. In December 1977, hoping a trial outside Aspen would improve his odds, Bundy secured a change of venue to El Paso County, Colorado, despite his lawyer's objections. Proud of his persuasion skills, Bundy was stunned when his lawyer revealed that El Paso County included Colorado Springs, notorious for its high rate of death sentences. His expression quickly shifted, and one investigator observed, "The change was in microseconds. The man in the dark had just been exposed to the light." Determined to escape again, Bundy made his move on December 30th, 1977. Using clothes and books to create a decoy in his bed, and with over $700 in donations, he squeezed into the crawl space above his cell, broke into the chief jailer's vacant apartment, changed clothes, and walked out to freedom. This escape proved more successful than his first, as Bundy journeyed across the country to Tallahassee, Florida, under the alias Chris Hagen. Initially, he intended to lay low and find work, but by mid-January 1978, his violent urges resurfaced, leading him to student nightclubs. Eventually, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, where he attacked Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, fatally beating them with a wooden log. He also attacked survivors Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas before fleeing. As Tallahassee reeled, Bundy coolly joined his housemates discussing the shocking crimes, even speculating that this was probably a professional job. By early February, he checked out of his hotel, targeting Kimberly Diane Leach, a 12-year-old at Lake City Junior High School. Witnesses saw him forcing her into his van. He then drove to an abandoned shed, where he assaulted and murdered her. While attempting to cross into Alabama, Bundy was stopped by Patrolman David Lee for driving a stolen Volkswagen, ironically, the same car model linked to earlier crimes. After resisting arrest and attempting to flee, he was subdued, marking his final capture. In custody, Bundy made one last call to Elizabeth Kendall, confessing he was consumed by an incomprehensible sickness. Though he evaded discussing the Chi Omega murders, this was their final conversation. During interrogations, he hinted at guilt but remained vague. In July 1978, he was indicted for the Chi Omega murders. Despite being advised to plead insanity, Bundy refused, viewing his acts not as insanity but accomplishments, rejecting a plea deal that could spare him from the electric chair if he admitted to killing Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and Kimberly Leach. On July 23, 1979, Bundy was found guilty of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death, with Levy's bite mark as key evidence. In January 1980, he was also convicted of Kimberly Leach's murder and sentenced to death again. On February 9th, the 2 years anniversary of Leach's abduction, Bundy married Carol Boone, a friend who believed in his innocence and visited regularly. In October 1982, Boone gave birth to their daughter, conceived during a conjugal visit. Ted Bundy's only known child, Rose, was born during his marriage to Carol Ann Boone. Carol divorced Bundy in 1986 after coming to terms with his guilt for the crimes that had landed him on death row. Throughout the 1980s, Bundy's story gained widespread attention, becoming the subject of two best-selling books: The Stranger Beside Me by crime reporter and former friend Anne Rule, and The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy by his former girlfriend, Elizabeth Kendall. These works explored how both women had been deceived by Bundy, with Elizabeth especially feeling compelled to publicly address her time with him. Other significant revelations about Bundy emerged in the mid-1980s. In 1984, during a series of interviews with investigator Bob Keppel, who was examining murders linked to the Green River Killer, Bundy's disturbing psyche was further exposed. Keppel observed Bundy's lack of remorse, evident delight in recounting his crimes, and even envy over the Green River Killer's deeds. In 1986, just hours before his scheduled execution for the murder of Kimberly Leach, a Supreme Court ruling delayed his death sentence for a psychological review. However, justice ultimately prevailed, and Bundy's execution was rescheduled for January 24, 1989. As his final days approached, Bundy became more open about his crimes, confessing to additional murders and describing his warped pleasure in witnessing his victims' final moments, believing this act bound them to him eternally. On the day of his execution, Bundy, now calm, bid farewell to his lawyer and spiritual advisor, asking them to send his love to family and friends. At 7:06 a.m., the execution began. Dr. Frank Kelo confirmed his death after removing Bundy's black hood, declaring him deceased to those present. Bundy's journey into infamy began with small acts of defiance and escalated in the 1970s to a killing spree that claimed over 24 victims. While much about his early life remains unclear, Bundy's deceptive charm allowed him to live a double life, even charming his way out of police custody multiple times, often due to minor infractions. Modern forensic advancements make it highly unlikely that a killer like Bundy could remain undetected today. What are your thoughts on Bundy? Do you believe he is one of history's most horrific serial killers? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.